Hello everyone, I'm David Webb from Acas. Acas is an organisation that offers impartial advice to employers and employees to help them with matters in the workplace. Acas has a website, a helpline. It also runs training courses and has special advisors that can come into your business to help. My particular role is to research and communicate advice. Today we're here to talk about one particular matter, which is preventing discrimination in the workplace because of pregnancy and maternity leave. But next I'll let the other members of the panel introduce themselves. Liz and Julie.
So I'm Julie Dennis and I'm the Head of Diversity and Inclusion for Acas. Part of my role is actually to make sure that Acas as an employer does the right thing when it comes to pregnancy and maternity, but also to make sure that our guidance externally is what the customer is after.
And I'm Liz Gardiner and I'm from the charity Working Families, and we're a campaigning charity that works on improving work-life balance for everyone. We work with employers and award best practice and research into what really works for good employers. But my role here today is as a legal advisor on Working Families free helpline, where we give guidance and advice and information to employees, particularly around parental rights at work.
Thank you very much, both. Acas has just launched new advice on preventing pregnancy and maternity discrimination at work, and today we're going to talk about some of the main issues in that area. Now, I thought we could start by trying to explain what pregnancy and maternity discrimination actually means. To try to put it as simply as possible, and you can chip in when you're ready, it's really that the employee should not be treated unfairly. I think that's the best way to think of it without getting too technical, because the employee becomes pregnant, she is pregnant, or that she will want to take maternity leave and she legally has to take a certain amount, or that she's planning to take maternity leave. Now, it can be wider than that as well, in that unfair treatment can also mean that she must not be put at a disadvantage because of anything linked to her pregnancy and maternity. So, for example, that might be she might be off sick with an illness linked to her pregnancy or maternity. That might be morning sickness, and that must not be added to her sickness record for any other illness that's not to do with her pregnancy or maternity. Now, I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to sort of add about that at all.
I think in relation to sickness and sickness during pregnancy, you're quite right, Dave. I think what employers need to make sure is that their managing attendance policies do take into account that there may be occasions where a woman will be off work because of a pregnancy-related sickness or absence, and they need to make sure that that woman does not get penalised through that sickness absence process. Because sometimes employers may have linked when they're looking at promotion that it goes on your sickness absence. So again, if you are penalising someone because they're off for a pregnancy-related illness, that could be seen as pregnancy and maternity discrimination.
Yeah.
And the simplest thing is just to make sure that it's recorded as something separate from other kinds of sickness.
Yeah, that is very important, because the absences can be for other reasons. I think you wanted to touch on this later. We'll go into it in more detail about antenatal appointments.
Absolutely.
So there'll be, and those kind of appointments can take many different forms and be for many different reasons. But there will be times when the employee will have to be absent for those absences, for those appointments.
And I think the important thing about antenatal appointments is that if you're a pregnant employee, you're entitled to paid time off. Mm-hmm. Sickness when you're pregnant should be treated, in the same way as other sickness. So unfortunately, if you're off for a long time, then your statutory sick pay may come in when you're pregnant, and your policy, your normal sickness rules apply. It's just that you record it separately because it takes account of the fact that pregnancy is just a different thing from other kinds of sickness. But with antenatal appointments, you're entitled to be paid for the time off that you take out.
Yes. And I think something that also gets overlooked sometimes to do with antenatal is that the partner is allowed time off for 2 antenatal appointments to sort of go with their partner, but those are actually unpaid.
Yeah.
So,
and I think in light of that, Dave, employers also need to remember when we're talking about partners, that will also include if that pregnancy is in relation to same-sex partners.
yes.
So again, that is that same entitlement. So again, employers making sure that their policies doesn't, when they talk about partners, don't talk about men, because actually we know that women can be partners in part of that relationship. So making sure that entitlement goes across to same-sex couples as well.
Absolutely. Was there anything more that we wanted to sort of flesh out on that particular point at the moment? Or?
No, I think we're going to move on to how complex actually discrimination is, and that we think we might know what it means, but in fact it takes so many different forms. It's not just your employer being a bit unpleasant or making a rude remark about you when you're pregnant. It's all kinds of things. That starts when you might apply for a job, and it goes all the way through from promotions, probationary periods, and we see it on our helpline at every stage, through the pregnancy, through the maternity leave, and then after you come back as well.
Yes, I think that does need to be sort of firmly understood. I think in the guidance we've just produced, I think, and we only stuck to the key areas. There were about 10 areas where discrimination can arise from the kind of instances that you highlighted there, Liz. And often it can stem from an employer wrongly having a negative attitude towards pregnancy and maternity, where they see it as an inconvenience because there's a likelihood that the employee, because she's pregnant, she might be off work a little bit more, or when she goes on maternity leave, the employer's got to think, I have to find a temporary replacement, and that can all sort of become a bit of a negative attitude. And, you know, the employer does have to understand that that can lead to sort of treatment that disadvantages or treats the employee unfairly, and that is then likely to become discrimination in all those areas that you highlighted, such as going for promotion, asking to go on a training course, and that person being turned down because they're pregnant, and that is against the law.
Yeah, and it is quite shocking, isn't it, that we're still having to say all this at this day and age. But, you know, the Equality and Human Rights Commission last year reported that over 3/4 of women are treated negatively because of their pregnancy or maternity leave at some point during that period. So, you know, on the other hand, there's some really good practice out there, and some employers getting it right, and they're bending over backwards to make sure that they keep the communication channels open with their employees, they treat them well when they're pregnant, and they make it easy for them, smooth for them to come back in after maternity leave, because actually they see that there are benefits of doing so as well. You know, that's really good for the business if you can retain your really good employees that you've invested in and, you know, encouraged to come to work for you. You know, it's just such a false economy to discriminate against them.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that, actually. I mean, it costs employers so much to retain and recruit talented staff. So actually, why wouldn't you do the most you can to retain those skills? Because it does make good economic sense. But again, I think in terms of those employers that aren't getting it right, we also know, we've seen our call to our helpline go up. I think it's 10% in the last 12 months with people making queries around pregnancy and maternity discrimination. So whilst we, you know, can understand there are some really, really good employers out there, there's still a few of them just getting it that little bit wrong because they don't fully understand what that means or what rights an individual has when they become pregnant, and also that those rights continue through their maternity leave as well until they come back to work for you as an employer.
And I think that's something where the Acas guide and other websites, and Working Families has a website as well with information, that you can, if an employee knows their rights, they can take this and show their employer. And sometimes it is ignorance rather than ill will, you know. And so actually the guide's going to be really helpful like that, I think.
I think that picking up on something you said, Liz, well, two things actually. The point that it's some people find it shocking that this kind of discrimination is still going on now, but it is.
Sadly, it is.
And again, picking up on something you said, Julie, where it makes good business sense for an employer to look after their employee, treat them correctly, not discriminate against them. Because the other thing that strikes me is that other people who are not pregnant, they're going to see that mistreatment as well and think, my employer's not treating that person very well. How are they going to react in other circumstances? So again, that's another kind of thing that the employer needs to be very mindful of, is that not only does it make good business sense from the particular employees who are pregnant or maternity leave to look after them correctly, but instead sending the right messages to all of the workforce.
I think you're quite right, David, there, and I think it goes further. So there's the corporate social responsibility element there, and especially I think for those companies that have got a big customer reaching clientele out there, there's nothing worse than if you see your favourite supplier, be it in retail, banking industry, etc., and then you see that actually they're breaching the Equality Act and they're not treating their staff who become pregnant fairly. People vote with their feet, and you have seen people leave organisations in terms of using them as their favourite product because they see that they're not treating their employees fairly. But also, like you say, if you're trying to attract diverse talent to your organisation and you're trying to attract more women to your organisation, then again, if I know me personally, when I'm looking to work for an organisation, I will have a look and see how they're faring in terms of pregnancy and maternity discrimination. Because obviously, if an employer gets it wrong and it goes all the way to an employment tribunal, that is public. It's in the public domain, and it's quite easy for people then to see what has happened as a result of that. And yes, some employers can get it wrong, and if you see that the employer has made changes and has made improvements, then actually I'm probably more likely to think, well, I'd actually like to work for them because they've learnt by their mistakes. But if you can see that there's somebody who's constantly treating women unfairly, then I think there will be people who will think twice going to work for those organisations or buying for those organisations if they're providing a product.
Yes. Is there anything you wanted to add?
I certainly support all of that. And, working families, we're seeking out all the time the best employers and benchmarking them against good practice, which is another way of encouraging that really cultural change. But the thing about, employers, they can get it right at the top level and they can have all the right policies in place. But for us on the helpline, it's often brushing up against your line manager that hasn't been trained in the policies or doesn't understand what the organisation is trying to achieve. And so it's about getting good policies in place. It's also about making sure that practice is happening at all levels in the organisation, because it's often in little individual teams or one person that is doing the discriminating, and not the wider organisation.
Yeah.
And I'd agree with that. And I think if you look at most employment tribunals, it will not be that the policy was not in place. It was that there'll be somebody in the organisation who's just not followed the process, that hasn't either gone and got advice from HR or whoever in that organisation looks after those policies, and they, through their own naivety, think it's okay to treat someone in that way rather than follow what the policy says.
I think that's something that employers don't always understand, that it's not that they themselves can be held responsible for discrimination. They can also be held responsible, the employer himself, for the acts of their employees who behave inappropriately. They don't understand that. And one other thing that I thought of while you were speaking, Julie, was that I think something else that needs to be borne in mind is there are now more women in the workplace than ever before. It's almost now in the workplace like a 50-50 split. So that needs to be borne in mind.
I think it does, David, but I think also that employers need to be mindful that they're not unconsciously biased, so that they don't think, oh, well, we've got more women who work here, so they fully understand how maternity and pregnancy works, because, some of us, yes, I'm a senior woman in Acas, It's over 26 years ago since I was pregnant. The legislation is completely different to what it is now. So even myself as a line manager have to make sure that I'm well versed in the policies in Acas, and also I think it's good practice. If there's one thing an employer can do after this Facebook Live session is make sure that their line managers are aware, at the very least, of our brand new guidance on pregnancy and discrimination, because it's a really good, simple guide for those line managers who may not have had to deal with someone who's been pregnant.
Yeah.
You know, we have new line managers out there, and sometimes it's them that just might get it wrong, not doing it on purpose, but they're not sure of what the policies or what the law says.
Absolutely. Shall we move on to another aspect? This is a common question that often comes up from an employee, is that should I tell my employer that I'm pregnant? I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, we get that often on the helpline, and it's quite a tricky one, actually, because on the one hand, if you're quite new to your workplace, or you're in a probationary period, or you think that telling your employer that you're pregnant is going to alter your chances at work, whether it's a big promotion coming up or whether they're going to renew your contract, then you're going to be really wary about it. And so the legal side of it is you don't have to tell your employer you're pregnant until you want to request maternity leave, which is 15 weeks before the baby's due. So that's your really key date. But 15 weeks before the baby's due, you must tell your employer that you want to go on maternity leave, and you can claim your maternity pay at that time. But there's lots of advantages of telling your employer you're pregnant early. First of all, it's very difficult to say they've discriminated against you if they can argue, "Oh, we didn't know she was pregnant." So, tell them before they guess. That's always our guidance. But there's also some rights that you can exercise once your employer knows you're pregnant. The right to take time off for antenatal appointments, that's really important. But also if there are any risks at work, so health and safety issues. Now, there's a kind of general duty on employers, isn't there, to make sure that if they're employing any women of childbearing age, they should have covered the risks. But for every pregnancy, it's different, and there might be individual specific risks to you or your unborn child that you want your employer to investigate. And so a health and safety risk assessment is something that employers are entitled to if there's any evidence of any risk.
And those good employers will do that, but they'll also may look at temporary workplace adjustments for that mother-to-be, depending on the type of work they're doing. Now, I remember years ago I used to work in the fire service, so it was really critical that we knew if firefighters were pregnant. Didn't mean that we were going to take them off the run, but it did mean that we could look at minimising the risk to them and their unborn child. And there's lots of other industries out there where actually when you're pregnant, the risks do get heightened. So it's making sure that duty of care is followed. So I would encourage women, as soon as they know they're pregnant, as soon as they feel comfortable, to start sharing that information, to do that as soon as possible with their employers, rather than wait to that last minute 15 weeks before the baby is due.
Yeah, very much so. I also got asked a question, is that if I'm applying for a job, do I have to tell my employer that I'm pregnant? Now, you kind of touched on that, in that somebody could go along for a job, they know they're expecting, but they think if I tell the employer, they're not going to give me the job. Now, if the employer did that, that again is against the law, but the person going for the job is a bit wary. But the situation is that once they get the job, they do then have to tell the employer. I think the legal wording is as soon as is reasonably practical.
If it's gone past that 15
weeks,
yeah,
yes.
15 weeks, yeah.
Thanks for that one.
They don't have to do it straight away.
No.
But I think that's right. That tends to be our guidance. If you're really obviously pregnant, then you might want to say so in the meeting and explain what your plans would be for that for the job that you're facing. But mostly, it's very difficult if you're a job applicant to prove that discrimination has happened at that stage, because an employer could say, well, though you were very close, but they are, the other one picked you for the post for this reason, whereas you suspect that it was very difficult to prove that it was because of your pregnancy.
Yeah.
So keep it quiet until you've had the job interview, got the job offer, and then, using, obviously it helps your employer if you can plan ahead as far as possible.
And I think it's important to add on to that bit that, if you do choose not to say, you cannot be penalised if you get the job. You know, that employer can't then turn around and say, oh, well, you didn't tell us at interview, so we're going to withdraw the job, because that actually would be blatant pregnancy and maternity discrimination,
yes.
And you would have evidence there. So don't be frightened. I know a lot of us sometimes think, I don't want to go into an interview and not tell the truth. Well, actually, this is one of the occasions where you can keep that information to yourself until you get offered that job, and then disclose that you're pregnant.
And I think it's a question, as you say, of keeping quiet, because if an employer was to ask you, you know, about your question, the question about whether you were planning to have children, and so well, that too could be discrimination.
Yes,
so.
yes. Shall we move on to what a new mother should expect on return to work? Now, this can be quite a problem area as well.
It can, and you know, I think what she should expect is no surprises, because in the best case scenario, she's had plenty of contact with her employer, reasonable contact, not been harassed all the time, but she's kept in touch with her employer. She might have used her keeping in touch days to go in for a bit of training and catch up. She should know, she should have been told if there are any reorganisations in her team, and so she should know what to expect. And most importantly, she should be going back to the job that she left, because her right to return after maternity leave is to that job. And that's what the starting point should be. Yes, the rules changed a little bit after the first 6 months, but the starting point should be, my job's there, it's my job, and I'm entitled to have it back.
But I think actually it goes before that's happening. I think, you know, again, just before you're going on maternity leave, it's about having that conversation with your line manager about how are we going to keep in touch, what the expectations are, if you're wanting to look at the keep in touch days, which you can do up to 10 in a year of those. So really setting out the boundaries as to how we're going to keep you updated as to what's happening in the organisation. It also helps that woman feel part of the organisation still, if you do keep in touch with them. And I think if you set those boundaries just before that individual goes off on maternity leave, then actually when they come back, they shouldn't be those surprises as well.
Yes, and it'd be even to talk about the possibilities of things like, I think what they need to do is, as you say, have that meeting well before she goes on maternity leave, plan ahead, look at everything about, you know, when she returns to work, might she require flexible working? Obviously, there are certain rules when she has to put in a request, but we won't go into that now. But so, as you say, there are no surprises, so that when she goes back to work, then she's going in seamlessly, like she's never been away, because she's been kept in touch. That too can be a tricky area, I think, because some women might like lots of contact, and some might say, oh, I haven't got time for this, I don't want any contact at all. Now, this is where it gets a bit tricky, because the employer is allowed to have reasonable contact, because he has a duty of care for the employee. So if the employer just severed contact, well, the employee wouldn't like that, and the employer's not going to like that. So they do need to keep in touch, but it's about agreeing that level of contact and exactly how they're going to do it.
And contact isn't the same as working as well. You know, it's really important that women don't work more than those 10 kit days. And the keeping in touch days are entirely optional. So, as you say, some women will want to keep in touch with the workplace, will want to attend staff meetings or training and so forth, and can use their keeping in touch days for that. But other women, you know, actually, I'd like to be left alone, bonding with my baby and coming back, and I'll speak to you before I come back. And that's fine too.
I think the other thing in relation to that as well is, again, employers need to understand that unfortunately not every pregnancy is really straightforward. So again, it will depend on that mother, on how much contact she wants. You know, if you've got a mother who ended up having a child that's been born prematurely, and therefore there may be complications with that, she may want less contact, she may want more contact. And again, I think that's why it's really important that you have that meeting well before that individual's due to go on maternity leave. So then you can talk about how would you like us to keep in touch? What is the best way to contact you? What are the best contact numbers? And again, as part of that keeping in touch, setting out, again, recognising that you may need to change the parameters if things can change, because, you know, sometimes complications can happen in pregnancy, unfortunately. And so again, it's about employers being mindful to that as well.
I think something else that needs to be understood is that when they have employer and employee have that chat and they come to an agreement, obviously, you know, the birth might not go as planned, the maternity might not go as planned, and so the employee is not obliged to stick to what she agreed. She can change that. And again, the employer needs to understand that as well.
And I think the law's helpful in saying that word reasonable. That's what we're looking for, people to be reasonable. And that might mean, as Julie says, being flexible, you know, and that's fine. But I think you know, employers that are expecting anyone to stick to any rigid plans before you have a baby, particularly if it's your first child, you just don't know what to expect.
And you don't know how you're going to react. And I think, again, not to make assumptions, because sometimes it might happen after your third baby. You know, we all act differently when the child comes along, and what we might have done with our first pregnancy, we may want to do something differently. So again, for that flexibility to be built in and to be built in on both sides is fantastic.
Is there another topic we'd like to sort of just dip into here? Can I be dismissed if I'm pregnant?
Sadly, yes, you can. There isn't a law that says you can't be dismissed when you're pregnant or when you're on maternity leave, but it's the reason that you're dismissed. So you're an employee all the way through, and you should be treated fairly as with any other employee. So yes, if you've come, you know, if your fixed term contract ends and there is not a possibility of it being renewing, yes, if your performance is bad, then yes, you can be dismissed. But if you have any suspicion that it's for a reason connected with your pregnancy or your maternity leave, get advice quickly, because there are very strict time limits in bringing claims against employers. And it's a tricky area, but I think, you know, or get some advice is the best thing to do.
And again, I think just picking up on that way you talked about performance, again, a good employer would look at the reason why has that individual's performance dipped, because actually their performance could have dipped because of their pregnancy. You know, they may be having horrendous morning sickness, which could have an impact. So again, looking at, have I put all the adjustments in place to enable this employer's performance to go up? And I think that's a big difference between actually you may have somebody whose performance has been dipping and then they become pregnant. It's really different from actually they were performing fantastically, then all of a sudden they become pregnant and the performance dips. For me as an employer, that would ring alarm bells that I'd want to look into that a little bit more before going straight down that route.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to point out here is that you've got a day one right to unfair dismissal if it's because of your pregnancy or maternity leave. In fact, most employers have to have 2 years before they can actually bring a claim for unfair dismissal, 2 years service. But if it's for a reason connected with your pregnancy or maternity, you know, it's an unfair dismissal, automatically unfair dismissal.
And I think the bottom line is, so employees are crystal clear, you cannot dismiss an employee because she's become pregnant,
Yes.
or because she's going on maternity leave,
or because she's on maternity leave.
No, yes, absolutely. And I think you were touching on managing performance. I think an employer needs to be careful as well how they measure that performance, because if, as you've already touched on, they're thinking, I'm going to sort of take action against this employee because she's not performing as she was, then they've got to be very careful that it's nothing to do with her pregnancy. You know, she could be suffering from extreme fatigue, but just not say anything and keep on turning up for work and doing her best. And I think the employer's got to be sort of mindful that if there was a problem beforehand, then before she became pregnant, then they can sort of pick that up and carry on with it. But they can't be influenced in any way with any factors that might come in because of her pregnancy or maternity.
That's a very good way of looking at it.
Well, I think we've actually sort of run out of time here. I hope you've all enjoyed the discussion and found it useful. I'd like to thank very much Julie Dennis and Liz Gardiner for their fantastic contributions. If you'd like to know more, you can go to the Acas website, which is www.acas.org.uk, or you can go to the Working Families website, which is www.workingfamilies.org.uk, and you might also like to know that Working Families has a free helpline for employees, But thank you for joining Julie, Liz and myself, and goodbye.